Okay. Welcome, and thank you guys for joining the North Olympic Library System's summer reading program presentation of After the Blast, Mount St. Helens 40 years later. The North Olympic Library System acknowledges that the land on which we live and gather are the appropriated homelands of Indigenous people. We want to express our deepest respects to those peoples past and present, including the Hoh tribe, Jamestown's S'Klallam tribe, Lower Elwha Klallam tribe, Makah Indian tribe, Quileute tribe, Quinault Indian Nation, Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe, and the Skokomish tribe for their care of these lands throughout the generations. Let us learn more about the history, cultures, and traditions of Indigenous peoples. Let us strengthen relationships with sovereign tribal nations to provide an inclusive space, fostering innovation and collaboration at the library. Everyone has been muted, and we ask that videos be turned off to help preserve with the bandwidth. For those that are viewing in Zoom, please watch in speaker view for the best viewing experience. If you need help locating or how to switch that, we can help you in chat. And if you have any questions about that you want to submit to Eric, or you have technology questions, please enter them in the chat also, and we will help you there. After today's presentation, you will receive an email link to the Humanities Washington audience evaluation. Please take some time to fill those out, as they're essential for continuing funding for these great programs. Also, if you visit nols.org, you will be able to get access to see what other exciting programs and services that the library is offering. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating space to explore different perspectives. Thanks to support of the National Endowment of Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. Tonight's speaker is Eric Wagner. He is a writer and a biologist. He holds a PhD in biology from the University of Washington, where he studied penguins. He is also the author of 3 books, including After the Blast, The Ecological Recovery of Mount St. Helens, which can be found in the catalog. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Orion, and High Country News, among many other places. Before I let Eric get started, I would like to note that the Speaker Bureau program is designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing perspectives and viewpoints, but we also ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. I hope everyone enjoys tonight's program, and I will hand it over to Eric.
Okay, and I will unmute myself. Thank you, Jennifer, for that warm introduction, and thanks to the North Olympic Library System for hosting me. Let me share my screen so you don't have to just look at my face, which, I don't know, might not really be your thing. Okay, so I'm gonna close all this stuff, make it so I can see, I can't even see my face, which is really preferable for me. All right, so thank you again for joining me. And tonight, I'm going to talk to you about Mount St. Helens and After the Blast, 40 years of lessons from Mount St. Helens. And so let's get started. So this is a view of Mount St. Helens taken from the Mount Margaret backcountry, which is about 8 miles northeast or so of the mountain. And for many Pacific Northwesterners, this is a pretty iconic view of the volcano. You know, you have the sort of the gaping crater, the gray landscape around it, a little bit of returning green and a few sort of stubborn trees. And because this is, you know, sort of Mount St. Helens is kind of an iconic sort of figure in Pacific Northwest geography. It's a real sort of regional marker. And the 1980 eruption, especially for many people, anybody who was really alive and cognizant in 1980 remembers where they were when they heard that Mount St. Helens had erupted, had blown its top. And because of that, it has the quality of being a very known story, a very familiar story. And so when I was working on the book, after the blast book, I would, people would ask what I was doing. I'd say, oh, I'm writing about Mount St. Helens and the 1980 eruption. And they'd say, oh, Mount St. Helens, huh, interesting. What are you going to say that's new? And at the time, I was reading all these studies and following all these scientists and trying to learn about all the research that had been done at Mount St. Helens since the eruption. And for me, it was all new. It was too new. It was overwhelmingly new. I was having trouble wrapping my arms around it and making sense of it. And so I'd kind of grit my teeth and say, oh, I'll try to figure out something to tell you that you haven't heard before. And so for this talk, that's kind of a little bit of what I want to do. I want to show you a bit how the story of Mount St. Helens has changed in the intervening decades since the 1980 eruption, to give you a sense of how the story has kind of evolved, and the ways of thinking about the mountain and about the eruption are kind of changing. But first, I want to sort of situate the mountain for you. So Mount St. Helens is part of what's called the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is this 20,000 or 25,000 mile arc of volcanic activity that stretches around mostly the Pacific plate, but some of the other tectonic plates as well. And you can see that it starts down in this map. All the little black triangles represent active volcanoes, or volcanoes that were at least once active, if not right now. And so that you can see that it kind of starts from the southern tip of South America and stretches up through Central America to the Pacific Northwest of the US and a little bit of southern Canada, to the Aleutian Islands especially, and over to Russia and down through Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, before ending in New Zealand with a few volcanoes down there. And so as you can see, I mean, just by the sheer density of dots, there are just hundreds of volcanoes along this ring, and about 400 are active at any one time. And so Mount St. Helens is part of within that sort of arc, that 25,000 mile arc. Mount St. Helens is part of the Cascade Range, which is about 18 active volcanoes that stretch from southern British Columbia to Northern California. And this is a slide from the US Geological Survey. So for them, apparently Canada doesn't exist, but there are a couple of volcanoes up there that are part of the Cascades. And this is Mount St. Helens circa 2016, a picture also from the Mount Margaret backcountry. And so Mount St. Helens, among the Cascade volcanoes, Mount St. Helens is the youngest. It's the sort of vent over which it sits is only about 40,000 years old. And the edifice, or the prominence, or what we think of conventionally as the mountain, is only about 4,000 years old at most. And so in geological terms, Mount St. Helens is just a baby. But it's a really squawky baby. Mount St. Helens, among the Cascades, is easily the most active of them, and it erupts about every 140 years on average. Not that you would necessarily have known it was the most active volcano to look at it before 1980. This is a picture of it from the late 1970s. And when you look at it, what you see is a pretty typical Pacific Northwest landscape with this nice snowy peak, rising over a deep mountain lake. And the other thing to note is that Mount St. Helens, because of its youth, it was known for its beauty, for being it's almost perfect symmetry. It was sometimes called the Fuji of North America. And one of the reasons that it was so beautiful, so symmetrical, was due to its youth. Glaciers hadn't had time to carve its summit into these sort of rumpled, rounded masses like nearby Mount Rainier or Mount Adams, which are much older. But human and geological time horizons began to converge in the spring of 1980, in mid-March, when on March 20th, a series of small earthquakes signaled to geologists that magma was on the move under the mountain, that the mountain was becoming active. And so this is there were a series of sort of small rattlings, and this was magma moving up into the edifice, moving up into the prominence. And so over the next several weeks through March and April, a magma chamber formed in the sort of under the northern face of the mountain and began to fill. And as it filled with magma, it began to expand, and it became known as the Bulge. And this is a picture taken facing the looking at the northern face of the mountain. And you can see how it's kind of distended a little bit, kind of like a frog. And it was expanding, this bulge was expanding by about as much as 5 feet per day. And also during this, in addition to the magma chamber forming and the bulge in that sort of deformation, there were these occasional steam eruptions throughout March and April. These, there'd be steam and ash sort of spilling out of a crater that was opening on the summit. And so you can see that this is from April, and so the mountain is still snow covered, but the snow is covered with ash, so it's becoming gray. And so in addition to the small crater, there's a crater of a few hundred feet on the summit. There were all these large cracks that were forming. And so all of this signaled to volcanologists and government geologists that something was going to happen. They were confident that Mount St. Helens was going to do something, but they didn't know what, and they didn't know when. And then something sort of curious happened in the beginning of May. All of this sort of geological, the seismic activity quieted. The mountain became very still, and it was quiet for a couple of weeks, and until one morning in May. And so what I'm about to show you are a series of photos taken by a fellow named Gary Rosenquist from the east side of the mountain at a place called Bear Meadow, which is about 11 miles away from the mountain. And so this first picture he took at 8:27 a.m. And 5 minutes later, at 8:32 a.m., Mount St. Helens was shaken by an earthquake that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. And the entire northern face of the mountain sort of rippled and churned and then collapsed in what at the time was the largest landslide known in human history, or recorded in human history. So the summit and the north flank just sort of rolled away in this, billions of tons of rocks and glacial ice and snow. And as this landslide occurred, as all this, all the tons of rock and glacial ice and snow rolled away, what they took with them was all of the weight and pressure that had until then held the superheated gases and magma in the magma chamber, kind of held them in place. And so with the landslide, all that superheated gas, all that pressure was gone, and so it was so released that there was a tremendous blast, a lateral blast, as superheated clouds of gas and steam and shattered rock just flew out over the landscape at about 600 miles an hour. And so this followed hard upon the landslide, and these huge clouds just rolled out over the landscape. And so this is a GIF of that event, or that scene from the west side of Mount St. Helens, showing more of the lateral blast, as it was called, from the beginning. So you can see how quick you can imagine how quick it was as these clouds just sort of billow out and then just explode. I'll let it run through one more time. And so once with the landslide gone and the magma chamber having vented, the ash and pumice began to billow out of this new crater, and this ash plume just grew out. It climbed about 15 miles in the sky in about 15 minutes, and it lasted for hours. And over the course of the day, geologists estimated that as much as 500 million tons of ash and pumice were ejected from the volcano, and so they floated up, and prevailing winds began to blow it east. And so what I'm going to show you is, so parked over this part of the country at the time was this government weather satellite. And so it was taking pictures of Washington about every 20 minutes. And the first one, it had taken a picture at, I think at 8:20. And sort of sometimes I wonder, oh, what if it had been, the schedule had it waiting another 12 minutes. So what you see here is a time lapse of pictures from 20-minute increments starting at 8:50, which so let's see, I'll let it go through one more time. So you can see the first one is sort of plain bare Washington right there, and then that's at 8:50 with the ash plume billowing out, and then prevailing winds began to blow it east. And so as it floated east, measurable ash was was found in 17 states. And then the cloud just sort of climbed up into the stratosphere, and it circled the globe in about 2 weeks. And so the last, in addition to the landslide, the lateral blast, the ash plume, and then there were a series of mud flows, the last sort of big part of the May 18th eruption were what was called pyroclastic flows. And so in the afternoon, after the ash plume had been boiling up for several hours, scorching hot rock came out of the vent and began to roll down the northern flank of the mountain. And, it was this blistering hot pumice that was about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the main eruption of May 18th lasted about 9 hours. And when it was done, this is what was left of what had been a perfectly symmetrical mountain surrounded by forest. Mount St. Helens had shed about 1,300 feet of elevation, and there was in place of that perfect peak was now this crater that was over 1 mile in diameter and 2,000 feet deep. And this is what was left on the eruption from a landscape perspective. So this is a sort of composite satellite image. And the interesting thing about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, or what made it so interesting to folks, was that most people, when you think of mountains erupting, it's a fairly sort of symmetrical affair where there's you have this image of a mountain and then it just kind of erupts up. But Mount St. Helens had erupted out. The lateral blast was sort of the main feature of that, these roaring clouds sort of spreading out over the landscape. And so because of that, its effects were pretty focused on the northern sort of quadrant in front of the mountain, or the northern face of the mountain in that sense. And so it had really, in effect, had just sort of spilled out over the land. And also because of all of those different processes that I mentioned, from the landslide to the lateral blast, the ash plume, and the pyroclastic flows, what this resulted in were a number of distinctive disturbance zones. So it wasn't that the land was equally affected by the eruption, but each part, different parts of the landscape were affected in different ways by different processes. And so what this left behind were a number of distinct disturbance zones, which are admittedly hard to see in this image. And so here's a map that sort of sketches them out. So what you can see here are all of those zones as they've been named. And what you can immediately sort of leaps out as the largest zone is the blowdown zone, this kind of beige colored area that stretches out in front of the mountain. It's over 200 square miles in area. And then the interesting thing, so this was the result of the lateral blast, those clouds that had roared out and knocked over all the trees, blown them down, which is why it's called the blowdown zone. Now, the interesting thing is, as those clouds had roared out, as the lateral blast sort of took place, as the farther they got, the more time, as the clouds were sort of passing, they were losing energy and force. So at the edge of the blowdown zone, this orange sort of rim is called the Scorch Zone, or the zone of standing dead. And this is parts of the forest where the lateral blast clouds were hot enough to kill all the trees, but not strong enough to knock them over. And so this is why if you're driving into the National Monument, you can sort of tell when you're passing into the Scorch Zone, because suddenly you'll see all these bleached white snags are sort of standing sentinel towards the mountain. And then you get into more of the blowdown zone where everything was knocked over. And then the other sort of main features of the blast area are this sort of yellow swatch you can see in front. And this is the debris avalanche, or the result of the landslide. So much of the rock and everything that had sort of come off the landslide was redirected west down the Tutel River Valley, of the North Fork Tutel River Valley. And so it traveled, the debris avalanche traveled about 14 miles and has an average depth of almost, I think, 600 feet. And then in front of the mountain, you can see is this sort of brownish patch. That's the pumice plain. And this is the leavings of the pyroclastic flows. So this is a 6 square mile apron kind of in front of the mountain that was buried by on average about 120 feet of pumice. So it's completely new land. It just buried everything under all this tiny scratchy rock. And then the last sort of features that you can see are this grayish sort of mud flow zone, which is what happened when a lot of the ice and glacial ice and snow melted and led to these devastating mud flows. But I'm not going to focus on that today. And this is what the eruption left behind, kind of from a landscape, to look at it, actually the effect of it upon the land. This is in the blowdown zone, and you can see all the trees that were just kind of sheared over by the clouds that rushed over them at over 600 miles per hour. And within the sort of Mount St. Helens annals, there's a famous incident where President Jimmy Carter came and visited the mountain just 4 days after the eruption. And so he flew in with his delegation. He flew out to take a helicopter tour of the mountain, and he left from Longview. And as he's flying with these representatives from the Forest Service, he's looking down at the land below and he's marveling at the devastation. Oh, it looks awful. Oh, what happened here? He's saying. And the Forest Service person who was with him had to say, oh, Mr. President, these are just clear cuts. We haven't reached the volcano yet. But when they did, he was still shocked and horrified. And when he got back, he said what has become a sort of semi-famous line within the Mount St. Helens community of, oh, the moon looks like a golf course compared to what's up there. So this is so in the immediate aftermath of the eruption, the first people to get in were rescuers, because the eruption had killed 57 people and a number of people were missing. And so National Guard helicopters were flying around. There were also folks from various other agencies searching for survivors. And geologists also went in, because they had been taken so by surprise by the eruption that they were kind of desperate to figure out if Mount St. Helens was going to erupt again. Was it completely spent? Nobody knew, because they had gone in with sort of certain expectations about what would happen. Those expectations had been totally swamped, and now they were sort of trying to right their intellectual ships, I suppose. And so, but there was another group of folks who were really interested in the outcomes of the eruption, and these were ecologists. But between the rescuers and the geologists, the ecologists were way down the list of people who had priority access. And so they weren't allowed to go in and land, but they would take these helicopter tours. They would fly over when they could. And this is kind of what they saw. This is a picture looking down on the mountain, again from the north, and you can see just how gray and lifeless and desolate it looks. I mean, it's still steaming. There were, if you flew down low, you can see there were some features, these little pits that had, where ice had erupted out or volcanic bombs had exploded. And it was just a completely, to them, it was a utterly lifeless landscape. But also for them, that lifelessness was a tremendous opportunity. They were assuming that it would take years, if not decades, for life to return to the blast area. And for them, that was really exciting. That was an exciting prospect, because it meant that what they would be able to do would be to study the way that life returns after it has been completely, absolutely destroyed. How does it sort of creep back little by little into a place where it has been just sort of violently ejected. And so, finally, after a couple of weeks, they were given permission to land. And so a helicopter lifted off, and in it were 3 ecologists, or actually 2 ecologists and a geomorphologist. But the 2 ecologists were Jerry Franklin, a forest ecologist, and Jim Sedell, who was an aquatic ecologist, and he studied lakes. And so they flew to a place called Ryan Lake, which is about 8 miles from the mountain. And this is, as they approached, this was the land that what they saw. They were getting pretty close. It was just gray. It was trees knocked over, and actually a little bit of blue sky. And so they landed, and the helicopter pilot told them that they would only have about 15 minutes, and they weren't to walk far from the helicopter, because they might have to leave in a hurry. And so it was with these warnings sort of rattling around his head that Jerry Franklin opened the door to the helicopter and leapt out and looked down at his feet. And what should he see but this little green shoot poking out of the ash? And this is that shoot a little while later, a couple of months later. And Jerry Franklin was a good forest ecologist. He was able to recognize the shoot, and he knew that it was a fireweed. And this is what fireweed looks like as a mature plant. You've probably seen it if you have driven along any highway anywhere. It's in its flowering form. It can be very tall. It's also super common. It's found all over the world. And in this sense, it's what biologists call a classic pioneer species in that it prefers disturbed habitats.
A lecture on Mount St. Helens.
And I think I'm hearing somebody who is, oh, thanks. So it prefers disturbed habitats and is often one of the first. It has its English name in the US gets its English name from being one of the first plants to return to places that have had devastating forest fires. And in the UK, it's sometimes called bombweed because it was one of the first plants to grow in bomb craters in London during the Blitz in World War II. And in the way that Mount St. Helens was perfect habitat for fireweed, fireweed was a perfect species for Mount St. Helens. What I'm going to show is a series of photos from just a single patch over the course of a single summer. So fireweed, it can grow very quickly. This is, it can mature in just a single season. And then at the end, that season, it produces tens of thousands of seeds. And each seed, it's sort of like a dandelion. It's a tiny little seed wrapped in a tuft of sort of cottony substance, and the wind can pick it up and carry it for miles. And in this way, fireweed can spread far and wide without really expending much effort or energy at all. But the other thing that fireweed can do is it can regenerate from just almost any little tiny bit of root or shoot. So even if a little bit of remnant root will do to let a fireweed persist. And Franklin knew that this was what had happened, what he was seeing at Mount St. Helens, because bear in mind, it was May. So it was the beginning of the growing season, not the end. And so what he surmised was that a fireweed had been in this spot at Ryan Lake and had gotten sheared off. The plant had gotten sheared off, and then the sprout was coming from the root that was left in the soil. And when he looked around, as his sort of vision was clearing, he saw that it was not just fireweed that was growing in this place. This is a picture of huckleberry sprouts and other shrubs that were growing among the roots of a blown down tree. And there were pearly everlasting shoots bursting up through cracks in the ash. And this is not what they expected. This is seeing plants, and there are also animals. There were ants scuttling around and birds flying and insects buzzing about. This is not what they had expected to see at all. They had expected invasion and decades-long recovery, but they understood very quickly that the post-eruption biotic community at Mount St. Helens, it would be unexpected. It would be diverse, the response would be rapid, and it would just be full of surprises. And so because of that, they felt there was an intense need to study it. And so in part due to their efforts and those of a number of other sort of local advocates, the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument was created in September of 1982 by President Ronald Reagan. And what the monument did was it placed 110,000 acres, most of it north of the mountain, under protection to allow, in what has become another famous phrase at Mount St. Helens, to allow geologic forces and ecological succession to continue substantially unimpeded. And so decades of subsequent research of Mount St. Helens have shown the influence, or sort of two main influences on the biological community there. These are survivors and colonizers. And the survivors of the eruption were those that would come from within the blast area, organisms like the fireweed, like pearly everlasting, like huckleberry, these things that somehow had managed to weather the eruption's worst effects and sort of would pop back. And then the colonizers would arrive from outside the blast area. And this was more of the sort of the conventional model. You would think this patch of land has been cleared and there's some sort of, group of animals and plants outside, and they'll start to kind of come back in. So within the survivor colonizer framework at Mount St. Helens, there have been two main mascots from the fairly early days. And so the first one is a pocket gopher, which is kind of the classic survivor at Mount St. Helens. And it survived in the blowdown zone and elsewhere. And then there is a classic colonizer, which is the prairie lupin. And so I will say that if you want to learn more about the pocket gopher and the prairie lupin, you can read my book. There's a lot of stuff about there in them. They're fascinating creatures. The pocket gopher, as you can see, is very cute. The prairie lupin is very pretty, and they both have a lot of sort of interesting work associated with them. But one thing, while I was at Mount St. Helens, and one day I was walking around with the main biologist, actually many days I'd be walking around with the main biologist, and, he'd say, oh, are you going to talk about, pocket gopher and prairie lupin? I'd say, yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to. And he'd say, pocket gopher and prairie lupin, pocket gopher and prairie lupin. All anybody wants to talk about are the pocket gopher and the prairie lupin. Please talk about something else. And so in due deference to him, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about these newer, what I think of as newer mascots at Mount St. Helens. And so the new one of them I'm going to talk about is the rainbow trout, which is kind of the new colonizer. And the second is the elk, which I think of as kind of a mix of a survivor colonizer. And both the rainbow trout and the elk, for me, illustrate something about the contemporary state of the mountain and how, kind of the story of Mount St. Helens is changing over the years. But they also point to this kind of tension in the mountain, in the monument's purpose. So when we say that we have set aside a space to let things, to let ecological processes happen substantially unimpeded, but these both the trout and the elk, they make us ask difficult questions about what we really mean. And so I'm going to start with the rainbow trout. So this is the rainbow trout, Oncorhynchus micus. It's a salmonid, which means it's in the same family as the five, the famous Pacific salmon that we all know and love, like the Chinook and the pink and the coho. It's a really popular game fish, a super popular game fish, and it's been introduced all over the world in all sorts of places where it is, where it would occur on its own or not. And as a sign of its popularity, a sign of its diversity and its wide-ranginess, there are a number of subspecies, from coastal rainbow trouts to rainbow trouts that are associated with particular rivers or valleys. And then there's also the sea run, an anadromous, which means a trout that is hatches in freshwater and migrates out to the sea, the steelhead, which is sort of classed within the five salmon. And so for me, the story of rainbow trout at Mount St. Helens is a story of Spirit Lake. And so this is, as you may recall this picture, this is Spirit Lake before 1980. Again, if the scene is a sort of typical Pacific Northwest landscape in that way, or Cascade landscape, Spirit Lake was a pretty typical Pacific Northwest mountain lake in that it was clear, it was deep, it didn't have a lot of nutrients, which meant it's nutrient poor, or as we also sometimes say, oligotrophic. But the thing to also note that I point out now is it was a really popular recreation spot. You can see all the boats are on it right now, and the shore of the lake had a lot of cabins and lodges and scout camps and opportunities for folks to come up and spend time, and people really enjoyed it. I mean, who wouldn't want to go up to Spirit Lake and look at Mount St. Helens right there on your doorstep? And this is Spirit Lake immediately after the eruption. You can see quite a bit different. This is looking at it from Mount St. Helens. Probably somebody climbed up there and pointed down. This is looking, that's Mount Rainier behind. And so Spirit Lake really bore the brunt of the eruption's most sort of powerful and devastating processes. So I mentioned the landslide in the beginning. So with a little more detail about that, the landslide, when it happened, when the north face it went in 3 blocks. So three large sort of sections. And the first section slammed directly into Spirit Lake, which is about 3 miles from the mountain. And there's speculation that all of that, rock and some such may have hit the lake with such force that it caused this tremendous wave, what's called a seiche, that the whole basin may have emptied of water as it kind of washed up over the hillside. And so the other thing to remember is that as the landslide is rumbling along, so it was going at about 150 miles an hour, seconds behind it, hot on its heels, were the lateral blast clouds racing at over 600 miles per hour. So they quickly overtook the landslide. So there's the landslide is rumbling down towards Spirit Lake, and then the clouds fly overhead, and they knock down all the trees. And so by the time that all the rock hits in the lake and all the water washes up the hillsides that surround the basin, all the trees around it have been knocked over. And so the water rushes up and as it comes back, it drags all the trees and dirt and dead animals and everything else left behind by the lateral blast clouds. It drags them all back into the basin. And so what you see on the lake here, on the lake surface, that what looks like this sort of whitish skim, is actually tens of thousands of logs, some of them quite large, from a number of species of conifers and other trees that were growing on the slopes of those hills and mountains around it. So Spirit Lake, yes, much change. The debris from the debris avalanche raised its bottom about 200 feet. And that increased its surface area. It nearly doubled from 1,300 acres to about 2,200 acres. And then, of course, the logs that I mentioned, that skim, as it's called, the log mat, which immediately after the eruption covered about 40% of the lake's surface. And so when researchers arrived at Spirit Lake to sort of see what was up, this is what they faced. This is a researcher looking out on the southern shore, looking, out towards the Mount Margaret backcountry. You can see that this person is wearing a sort of helicopter suit, gazing down at their feet, perhaps in despair. And because the lake that they found was pretty gnarly, the water was black, it was stinky, it was so cloudy that you could put your hand in it just under, and if you wiggled your fingers just a few inches under the surface, you couldn't see them. Not that you would necessarily want to stick your hand in it, because the lake was just full of bacteria, because all the sort of anaerobic bacteria that feast on chemicals and organic matter were just thriving in the lake immediately after the eruption. And the other thing that happened in the first couple of years was researchers who were working at Spirit Lake would come down with what they called red zone fever. They would get the kind of chills and a cough and feel kind of crummy for a few days, and they kind of laughed it off, ha ha ha. But eventually they figured out that there were actually being this red zone fever was being caused by two species of Legionella bacteria, which is the type of bacteria that cause Legionnaire's disease. And these were new species, and they were duly named Legionella spiritensis and Legionella St. Helensi to commemorate their origins. But the interesting thing about Spirit Lake was that the dynamics there of the response would be almost completely the opposite of what was happening on land. So as Franklin and his colleagues were documenting fireweed and the other plants just sort of slowly growing and filling up open spaces, but not very quickly, the lake water was clearing almost just within a few months. So what this picture shows is two sort of water samples. The one on the left is from August of 1980, and the one on the right is from May of 1981. So just by a year later, all of the it's a mountain lake in the Pacific Northwest, and in the winter, what happens? There's a lot of snow, there's a lot of rain, and this influx of fresh water began to kind of flush the lake out. And so phytoplankton and zooplankton returned to the lake in 1982. These are sort of microscopic plants and animals that form the base of pretty much any food web anywhere. And the lake itself was totally clear by 1983. And so this was the lake Spirit Lake in 1984, when it was considered sort of recovered. But we have to be very careful using the word recovery at Mount St. Helens, because to say that something has recovered is to imply that it has kind of returned to its former state. And that was not at all true at Spirit Lake, or really anywhere else at Mount St. Helens. And where Spirit Lake was concerned, the changes were pretty profound. In addition to the ones I mentioned earlier about it being elevated and a larger surface area, the lake had gone from being oligotrophic or nutrient poor to eutrophic or nutrient rich, because of all that stuff that had been sort of dragged back to it in the initial days. And so with all these new nutrients, there were more plants and there were more organisms. It was kind of this entirely new ecology, a lake very much reshaped. But there was one, as the lake was clearing, there was one particular class of organisms that folks were really interested in, and these were fish. So Spirit Lake before the eruption had been stocked with rainbow pretty vigorously. you know, a lot of the mountains or the lakes around Mount St. Helens have been stocked with fish. And so state biologists wanted to know how those fish had fared. And so what this picture shows is a biologist sampling a different lake, not Spirit Lake, but one of the Mount Margaret backcountry lakes at Alpine Lake up there. And so what they would do in 1980 and 1981 was they would helicopter to these backcountry lakes, and they would set a gill net, and they would bait it with chicken or tuna, and then they would come back the next day to see how it had fared, you know, to see if they caught anything. And often they had. In many of the lakes, they were catching brook trout, which had been introduced before the eruption. And the brook trout, you know, you might be thinking, how in the world did trout survive an eruption in a backcountry lake? And so remember that the eruption took place in May, and so many of these lakes were still covered with ice, especially at higher elevations. And so the ice acted as a shield. So even though, as you can see in the back portion of this photo, all the trees that have been knocked down, if the lake was covered with ice, you know, the fish that were in it and other things, you know, the amphibians or other aquatic invertebrates, they might, you know, perceive that there was something violent going on overhead, but they wouldn't be, you know, affected in the same way that organisms at Spirit Lake had been. But Spirit Lake was a different story from these other lakes, because there was no question of anything having survived there. So biologists had, you know, given the debris avalanches effects, and then the log mat, and then all the organic material and the anaerobic bacteria. There was nothing, you know, nothing that needed oxygen could have survived at all. And so, but that didn't stop them from hoping. You know, they'd been stocking Spirit Lake with as many as 40,000 trout a year since the early 1900s. And so, you know, you never know. Well, just keep looking. And so, but they would do these kind of intermittent surveys. You know, they kind of go out and throw out a net, and they wouldn't catch anything. But then one year in 1993, they caught a male trout, and there's two biologists from what's now the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife had caught this 8-inch long, quarter-pound male trout that they duly named Harry, after Harry R. Truman, the cantankerous owner of the Mount St. Helens Lodge, who had famously refused to evacuate before the eruption, and then died as a result when the landslide buried him and his lodge. So they went back, and so they had one trout named Harry in 1993. They go back in 1994. The next year, they catch a female trout. This one is 18 inches long and weighs 2 3/4 pounds, and they duly named it Harriet. And so those early 90s surveys precipitated a more sort of rigorous effort to document the return of rainbow trout. And so what this picture shows is two of the biologists, the main two who were involved in this, Bob Lucas in front and John Weinheimer behind. They kept going, they kept surveying. They would keep catching maybe a couple of trout every year. But then one year in 2002, they were out paddling around in a little boat doing a hook and line survey, which is to say they were fishing. And suddenly this enormous trout erupts out of the water at the end of Bob Lucas's line. And that, as he said, was how they knew that Spirit Lake had finally turned a corner. And boy, it had really turned a corner. The trout had, or the Spirit Lake trouts, the rainbows were huge. They were big and they were bitey. They were some of the largest rainbow trout found anywhere. On average, they were about 2 feet long and weighed about 4 pounds. But where they were from, that was a bit of a mystery. There was some speculation that they may have been able to recolonize the lake naturally during these intermittent reconnections of old streams to the lake, or, as is often the case, it may have been a more human-mediated introduction, because there had been crews from from the U.S. Corps of Engineers working on the lake for several years, and then, of course, there are people who would just sort of hike back into the backcountry with a few, a tub full of trout and dump them in the lake and see what happens. And so where the Spirit Lake rainbows come from is still unknown. It's still kind of under dispute. But disputed or not, they were part of the system, and the monument has a research mandate, and so they should be studied. And so biologists started to study them. This is a photo of Charlie Crisafulli, the main biologist who worked at Mount St. Helens for about 40 years and still there. investigating a trout. And what he was interested in was finding out, what are the rainbow trouts eating? Where are they spawning? And what he found was that the rainbows were treating Spirit Lake effectively like an ocean. What they would do is they would spawn in these tributary streams, and then the young would hatch and migrate down to the lake. They would stay in the lake for a couple of years, and then they would migrate back to these streams to spawn. And what they were eating was tons of small snails. Remember that now the lake had all these nutrients, so it had all these aquatic plants, so it had lots of snails on these plants, and the trouts would just kind of go and bite a clump of plant and chew up all the snails that were on it. Or they would kind of scour along the bottom. Charlie would find trouts that had their chins were abraded from kind of benthic scouring. But the other thing that he found, and this was notable, was that the trout, which had been enormous, were actually starting to shrink. They started to shrink in just a couple of years after they were, the banner year in 2005. And so they were shrinking at a pretty steady rate, getting a little smaller and a little lighter every year. And so what has been found is that there is the same overall biomass of trout in the lake, but now it is just more smaller fish. And so the news of this shrinkage caused some consternation, shall we say, in the sort of local sort of fishing community, because one of the features of many of the state surveys of the lake was that they would have volunteers come up to help the biologist survey, which is give them a chance to go and fish for these really enormous trout that were very easy to catch. And so the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife began to agitate for a recreational fishery to be opened at Spirit Lake. But the Forest Service, which manages the monument, has so far said no, in part because there's only one trail that accesses Spirit Lake, and it's about a mile long and it's pretty steep. But more of a concern is the log mat, because woe betide the fisher who's so focused on reeling in their lunker trout that they don't notice that their boat has been completely encircled by logs and they have no way of getting out, which actually happened to some researchers in the past. And what usually ends up happening is a helicopter has to come and pluck them out, and then the logs crush their boat. And so far there is no recreational fishery and no plans for there to be one. But and this is that sort of tension, that wish and that desire, I suppose, or what makes the rainbow trout this mascot of this sort of new ecology at Mount St. Helens, because the pocket gopher and the prairie lupin are fairly explicitly ecological entities. But the rainbow trout is quite a bit more complicated. It was introduced pre-eruption to the mountain by people, but it was killed. All of them were killed in the eruption. The mountain effectively cast it out. And then it was brought back, or it has turned up, most likely by humans, but maybe not. Don't really know. But whether human introduced or not, its presence prompts a debate about the value of landscape and both about the monument's purpose. What and who is it meant for? Is it a place for us to just come and stand in this nature's cathedral and look around in silent awe, or is it a place to where people can go and have a good time and do some of the stuff that they used to do? But more than that, also it prompts these questions. The rainbow trout forces us to ask, what is natural in this landscape? What is unnatural in this landscape? Is the rainbow trout, is it sort of both? Is it neither? I mean, it's a type of animal that some biologists have called an entirely synthetic fish because of all the ways it's been manipulated over the years. And so there are really, no easy answers to these questions. And so having left us in that muddle, I will move on to the elk, which is the sort of the new survivor / colonizer. And so this is a picture of a bachelor herd of elk on the pumice plain right in front of the mountain. So elk in the eruption, what happened to them? Sadly, there would be no sort of tails, them and other sort of what are called surface dwelling wildlife or above ground fauna. There'd be no tales of plucky survivors as there would be with, say, pocket gophers or things like that. Pretty much any elk that was within the reach of the eruption's main effects was killed. Afterwards, state biologists estimated that 1,500 elk died in the eruption, to go along with about 5,000 black-tailed deer, maybe 200 black bears, and then some unknown numbers of cougars and bobcats. So with that in mind, since it was, mostly this sort of specter of death, the scientific approach with elk would be different. So in the absence of plucky survivors, you could still learn from the dead, and specifically from the locations of their bodies. And so what this picture shows is an elk skeleton that has been dug out of some of the volcanic deposits, the ash and mostly ash, yes, and debris in the debris avalanche zone. And so sometimes, biologists would be going around and they'd be looking at these kind of gray wastes, and they would see these tiny little patches of green. And if sometimes they would go over to this patch of green in an otherwise fairly gray area, and they'd start digging, and what they would find would be this elk skeleton just a little bit under the ground. And the green was plant seeds in its gut that it had eaten when it was killed, and the plant seeds were germinating. And so, they would liken these skeletons to Pompeii, the city in front of Mount Vesuvius when it erupted in Italy, and everybody died, and then they were later found in these sort of grotesque poses. And so knowing the locations of the dead elk would lead a couple of biologists at the University of Washington to try to ask questions about elk calving grounds. This was a pretty, a question of some interest to managers, because the way the sort of elk calving grounds work is, as you may know, sort of elk form these large herds in the fall as a male elk sort of spar with each other to sort of accumulate females, and then some of these females become pregnant, but then as their pregnant females are about ready to give birth, they separate themselves from the herd and they disperse and they go off to these kind of private spaces. And they're thought to do this as a means of protection, to protect themselves and their calves from predators, because it's a lot harder to find a single elk or two than it is to find the massive elk all kind of hanging out together. But this was, so they wanted to know where the elk were going, what sort of habitats they preferred. But this was in the pre-GPS tag days, pre-satellite tag, so there were basically, two ways to find out where an elk was if you weren't actively following it. And one of those ways was to put a radio collar on it around its neck, and then you would send some poor tech up to an exposed point with an antenna and just listen for the beep, 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 beep that told you vaguely where the elk was. Or what you could do is wait for a volcano to erupt and kill everything where it lay, and then go and pick through the remains. And so that's what they did. The biologists, they fanned out, they found many elk. What this picture shows is that it's taken from the offsite storage facility of the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture at the University of Washington. And these boxes are sort of the Mount St. Helens Elk Herd. Each one contains, up to 4 skeletons of elk that have been found, and, their locations. And so sometimes the elk that they would find would, be these males with their impressive racks of antlers, but sometimes in many cases the skeletons would be a female, and then within the female skeleton would be either the unborn fetus, or just a few nearby within a few yards of the adult female skeleton they'd find a much smaller skeleton, which was her calf. And so in this way, they were able to figure out the types of meadows around Mount St. Helens where the female elks had gone to give birth, which was a bit of a coup for them. But the thing to remember, or to keep in mind, is that 1,500 elk may sound like a lot of dead elk, but the Mount St. Helens Elk Herd as a management entity is made up of about 10,000 individuals. And so many of them survived outside the blast area, in some cases just outside the blast area. The person who took this picture, this shows some elk just sort of wandering around in the blowdown zone. You'll see it's by Evelyn Merrill, who's now at the University of Alberta. But in 1980, she was a graduate student at the University of Washington who was working at Mount Rainier, and then Mount St. Helens erupted, and she immediately translocated her study on elk down there. And she told me a story about working. She was down in a valley somewhere and looked up onto a hillside, and she saw several elk were kind of browsing and then watching her. And she thought their silhouettes looked a little bit funny. And so she got out her binoculars and was looking at them. And she realized that what was funny about them was that none of the elk had any ears. Their ears had been burned off by the lateral blast cloud, kind of in the same sense of like the trees in the Scorch Zone, where the clouds were still hot, but they weren't strong enough to kill you. These elk had been burned, but not killed. And so they were going through their life kind of marked in that way. But the other thing, the main point that she took away was that they had come back. And because elk are large and mobile, they were some of the first large animals to come back to the blast area after the eruption. And they came back quite quickly. Just within a few weeks, they were starting to poke around. And certainly by the summer, they were there in greater numbers. And what was it that drew them back? Were plants like fireweed. So this is fireweed, doing very well on the west side of Mount St. Helens. And Evelyn Merrill told me that fireweed for elk is basically like elk ice cream. And so the surviving plants that were busy taking advantage of these highly disturbed habitats, that the fireweed and others provided these high quality summer forage for elk. And in the winter, what they could forage on were grass and clover that were planted for erosion control in other parts of the blast area. So in the summer, they had the survivors to feast on, and in the winter, they had the sort of desperate attempts of humans to sort of scatter seed all over these highly erosive surfaces, and they could eat all those plants too. And so this is a picture of a mixed herd of elk on the debris avalanche deposits, and their numbers increased markedly and quickly. So in 1981, Dr. Merrill counted about 200 or so elk in the blast area. And by 1985, that, a few summers later, that number had more than tripled to over 600 elk in the blast area. And so, as elk were moving into the blast area, they themselves were becoming a sort of ecological force. And at first, they were a benefit for plants and other sort of species trying to establish. Elk droppings, this is a picture of some elk poop. The elk poop provided fertilizer for new plants. You can see some prairie lupin growing amongst the poop. I mean, each little poop is a little prill of fertilizer, of nitrogenous fertilizer. And then the elk themselves, their bodies acted as seed transport, not just the poop, but also seeds would cling to their fur, their pelts, and would fall, would be sort of scattered about here and there. And where would they be scattered about? In places where the elk were walking. So the other thing about elk that was really good was they have really sharp hooves. And so as they're walking over these hard ash crusts that were left behind by the eruption, they would break up that ash and sort of expose the soils that the ash had buried. And so the seeds that they were pooping out and the seeds that were falling off their fur could land in the soils and then germinate. And that made it easier for plants to reestablish. And also, as you can see, this trail, this is kind of a game trail going into the monument. The elk range far and wide. As the years went by, they would kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper into the blast area, and the plants were following them. But success for the elk was coming at a cost. As their numbers increased immediately after the eruption, they began to run into their carrying capacity, and that there really wasn't enough food for them. And so during especially harsh winters, many elk would starve. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife began these surveys in 1999 to document the number of winter kill elk, and they would find that sometimes as many as 150 would die due to the hardships of the environment. And so, the stories of starving elk would upset people out in communities outside of the monument. I mean, there would be these news, TV shows or TV segments about starving elk, showing these emaciated elk that were so weak they could barely stand. And this was a challenge because, the monument was a place basically for nature to take its course, and people understood that, but they didn't like to see nature taking its course quite like this. And so in response to community pressure, state and federal agencies began these winter supplemental feeding programs for the elk around Mount St. Helens, and they continue to this day. So just a couple of years ago, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation gave over $300,000 in grants for habitat enhancement, which is basically just putting food on the ground in the winter. And Skamania County in Southwest Washington, which is one of the counties in which Mount St. Helens sits, regularly treats about 1,200 acres of meadows and adjacent roads on the south end of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, where Mount St. Helens sits. They put hay out there. And so these programs provide vital forage for the Mount St. Helens elk herd. But so the elk herd in the years has really started to stabilize over the past few years. But in that, then, as they've stabilized and as the years have passed, as the community, the rest of the biological community at Mount St. Helens develops, the elk's influence on succession has begun to change. What this picture shows is a young conifer that is growing in the debris avalanche zone that has been heavily browsed by elk. You can see the bottom half of it has been nibbled down almost to the trunk. And this is a pretty common feature of trees as they return to the blast area. So as the years go by, in sort of as plants return, first there are going to be some small flowering plants, but then the trees are going to come. And so as the trees have started to come, the elk are waiting for them and they are eating the heck out of them. It's, sometimes to such a degree that the trees are growing, they stop growing vertically, but grow kind of horizontally or laterally. You'll see these kind of bushes that are actually a single Douglas fir that's kind of spreading out low along the ground in an effort to stay out of the way of the hungry elk. And in addition to the browsing, things that were formerly sort of a boon by the elk become a little less of a boon. This is, those sharp hooves that were so good at breaking through the ash deposits and opening up space for plants now trample the plants. You can see actually, having looked at this picture, that actually what that game trail is stomping through is a bunch of vegetation. And, one biologist told me that a single herd of elk passing through an area can set succession back about 10 years. And so that, this is clearly, as you would say, succession interrupted, anything that sets you back 10 years. But then it becomes as this succession impeded, as the monument says should not happen, that succession is supposed to happen substantially unimpeded. And so in response to the elk and their booming numbers and their complicated effects, people stepped in, and not for the first time. There was the first elk hunt at Mount St. Helens was actually in 1982, when people became worried about the elk, becoming too numerous, and they held a hunt on the outside of what is now the monument. And I somewhat, in the realm of unintended consequences, this is precisely what drove elk into the monument, was this first hunt. So elk moved in, and having seen that, 23 years later, in 2005, the federal biologists advocated for a elk hunt to get them out of the monument. What they wanted to do especially was reduce the population of elk in the pumice plain, which is, if you recall, was that area right in front of the mountain. So what they wanted to happen was there'd be a hunt for maybe 1 or 2 years. They would sell a select few tags to hunters to go into the monument, into the heart of the monument, in the pumice plain, get the elk out. That isn't what happened. Instead, the hunt was held in the Mount Margaret backcountry, which is the area that kind of is on the sort of fringe of the monument, and it's been held every year. And elk aren't stupid. They know that if they are within the monument, they are safe, and so they have stayed within the monument, and they show no signs of leaving. But and so these sort of consequences, this tangle, is why I think of elk as the other new mascot of the complicated ecologies of Mount St. Helens, because they provide such a good test on that phrase, ecological succession substantially unimpeded. And so they make you ask, unimpeded by whom? Unlike the trout, the elk are a, quote unquote, natural part of the landscape, in which they are a creature that was there before the eruption. They came back to the area on their own, and they really show, I think one of the things that makes them interesting for me is they show how difficult it is to draw a line around a place and say, within this space, there will be this, outside of this space, there will be that. And, this line somehow demarcates that, that this and that. But the elk, they kind of stitch it together. They pass between. The way people react to them in the outer space influences what they do in the sort of inner space. And they show, just how Mount St. Helens will always remain this really sort of beautiful and complicated place. And so what I wanted to close with is a time lapse of satellite images from 1979 to 2016. And to sort of revisit that question that I asked at the beginning, what do we learn at Mount St. Helens? What does it have to teach us? And what's sort of new about its story? And so the lessons of Mount St. Helens, I think, are pretty neat. They're that things can come back, that life is resilient, even in the face of what seems like an unfathomable disaster. Nobody expected things to come back to Mount St. Helens as quickly as they did. Many creatures, many plants and animals showed these sort of heretofore unknown capacities, if you will, to grow in places where people didn't know they could grow, to thrive in places that people didn't think it was possible to thrive. And that sort of sense of surprise at Mount St. Helens is one of its sort of most wonderful qualities. But the sense of surprise is also one of its more complicated qualities, because life can come back, life is resilient, but it may not come back as you expect it to or even want it to. And when that happens, when life does what life will, which is just kind of whatever it wants, then you have to decide how you feel about that. You have to ask, like, what, if anything, you should do about that in a place where you have said, we're just going to let things do what they will, and we aren't going to interfere directly until something happens, and then you find that maybe you should have interfered directly. And so these are really complex questions, and there are no easy answers to them. And that also, I think, is one of the really wonderful things about Mount St. Helens, is that these questions are still developing more than 40 years, now 42 years after the 1980 eruption. And so we can continue to ask what's new, and Mount St. Helens will always be showing us things that are new. So with that, I will say thank you for listening. Sorry I went a little long. I just really like Mount St. Helens a lot. And if you want to learn more, you can read my book, After the Blast, The Ecological Recovery of Mount St. Helens. It sounds like it's available at your library. You can also buy it if you are so inclined. And now I'm happy to take questions. And I will stop sharing.
Yeah, please, everybody, if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them in the chat, and I will share them with Eric. If you would like to raise your hand and ask a question yourself, you are more than welcome to do that also. Yes, go ahead. Is it Rini? Oh.
Renee.
Renee.
Hi, Renee.
Hi, this has been wonderful. I was stationed in Hawaii at the time, so I really am impressed with what's happened in my state. Because, there it just blew away if we had an eruption, and then it didn't bother us too much again.
Yeah, is that volcanoes are old news in Hawaii.
Yeah, right. It was established that we would not harm or hinder or increase the help that allowed the nature to come back. And yet we fed the elk, and the elk are there because they're so comfortable. Well, isn't feeding the elk kind of going against the laws of what you established this place to be?
I mean, it is, except that it happens outside of the place. So that's part of the thing, is that when I was the ways that the elk show that what you do out there can affect what happens in here. So, there's a sort of dynamic of the elk within the monument where, they were having a rough time, but then outside the monument where, you can do pretty much whatever you want, that's where a lot of that feeding happens. And so that's the way that, the sort of the dynamic between this kind of outer world and the inner the idealized space of the monument, where you can say, oh, in the monument, it's going to do whatever it wants, but then there are the people outside the monument who have their own thoughts and feelings and expectations and desires, and so that affects what happens inside the monument, and that's what shows that kind of complicated give and take, between the monument and the lands that surround it.
So the elk are actually having to go outside the monument in order to be fed.
Yeah,
to
they
eat.
move inside and outside the monument willy-nilly. Nothing keeps them in and nothing keeps them out. And so, they will move outside. They especially in the winters, they'll move out of the sort of the higher elevation areas where there's a lot of snow, there isn't a lot of food. They go down into the valleys. They do fine there, and then they move back into the monument in the spring and the summer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Cheyenne, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. If Mountain Helens ever became a national park, do you think that would devastate the land ecologically, or what do you think the effects might be?
That's a super good question. That's a super tough question. There actually, some folks are talking about that right now, and they feel like that is what should happen. Part of this, so I'm trying to think of a good way to say this in a time-sensitive manner, because you can go on and on and on. But one of the things about the monument and about the sort of monument system in the United States is that since they're all run by by different federal agencies, so whichever agency had controlled the land before it became a monument is the agency that manages the monument. And so you get these monuments that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service, and these agencies aren't necessarily perfectly suited towards treating lands in the ways that monuments are treated, if that makes sense. Whereas the national parks, they're more accustomed to, say, dealing with particular types of research questions or things like that. But there are also sort of different expectations for, say, tourists and national parks. And I know that that's one of the things where, there's so for instance, one of the big debates at Mount St. Helens right now is this there's a road that's been proposed across the Pumice Plain, in part due to some issues with Spirit Lake and that are complicated and probably too much to try to go through right here. And so the feeling there is like, if this were a national park, would there be a road? Would there be sort of more respect for the landscape in its current form? Would there be less of this kind of interventionist mindset that the Forest Service seems to bring? I don't know. I mean, there are other, as I said, it's complicated. There would be other things with the national parks where, maybe there'd be a lot, be more expectation for more sort of visitor services, more facilities, more of this kind of, and the other thing is that there is a national park about a mountain that's very close by. It's called Mount Rainier. And there's some, I think, a little bit of worries about competition or stealing the attention or things like that. So yes, Mount St. Helens, if it were managed as a national park, would undoubtedly look very different than it does today. It has a very rough quality that monuments tend to have. There were signs that were put up a long time ago. Roads wash out, they don't get replaced. I mean, this is, part of a budgetary backlog and a maintenance backlog that is probably very familiar to a lot of people who use public lands. So yeah, I'll just say that I guess I'll try to stop. You can see how it started. Once you get started on the national park versus monument question, you can run down quite a rabbit hole. But yeah, I'll just say that it's a question that people are wrestling with, and they will probably keep wrestling with it for a little while longer.
Okay, it looks like we've got some questions in the chat. John and Amy want to know, why not introduce predators?
That's a really excellent question. So why not introduce predators? I'm assuming this is in response to controlling the elk. So one of the things, there actually are a lot of the main predators have returned. So one of the things that people have been doing lately is they set up these remote cameras at different spots in the monument, and they've watched cougar come back and black bears are back, and it's, everything is back. But there's one key predator that's missing. Maybe you can guess what that is. It is the wolf. And the nearest pack, when you say why not introduce predators, I don't know if you've seen what happens when people try to bring wolves back to a place. It doesn't always go totally seamlessly. Probably the best hope for waiting for wolves is for them to recolonize on their own. The nearest pack, I think, is the Teanaway pack, which is about 90 or so linear miles away. But it's got several highways and some mountains to cross before it gets to Mount St. Helens. But the biologist who worked at the main, Charlie Crisafulli, who's the main one, who has a very a love-hate relationship with the elk. He's just waiting for the wolves to come back. He's expecting that they'll get back probably within maybe 20 years or so, a couple of decades. And then when they do, they will just have, kind of a wolf heaven in southwestern Washington, because Mount St. Helens sits adjacent the sort of largest or remaining roadless area, the Dark Divide, which is about 70 miles of forest between Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams. And then the Mount St. Helens Elk Herd, which is, as I said, it's quite large. It's 10,000 or so individuals. It may be a little smaller now. I'd have to check the number. But I mean, you have all these elk, you'd have all this space, you'd have none of the roads. There isn't a ton of ranching, at least not like in northeastern Washington, where there's so much sort of wolf livestock conflict, and they could really do some wolfness down around Mount St. Helens. And so there's probably no way in the world that they get reintroduced purposefully, but yes, there's a sort of waiting for the wolf air at Mount St. Helens.
So Preston Andrews asks, what was the effect on water quality downstream in the Tutel River after the eruption?
That's a great question. So that's also one of the really interesting things, touches on one of the most interesting things about the eruption, is how its effects really spread far and wide. They weren't at all limited to the 200 square miles that we call the blast area. And so the Tutel was hammered by the eruption. So the mud flows that I alluded to but didn't talk about were just devastating. If you're familiar with them, knocking out bridges and hundreds of homes, and the sediment plume, all the mud from the eruption, it blocked the Columbia, blocked commercial shipping for weeks. It just poured. So the Tutel River system connects to the Cowlitz, and then the Cowlitz River connects eventually to the Columbia. And so that's about 70 miles of river. And all of this mud just all the way down to the Columbia, so much so that the commercial shipping lanes were just pretty much, it became a kind of sediment dam that the US Corps of Engineers had to really spend a lot of time frantically digging out. And so to prevent that sort of thing from happening again, they built about, I want to say about at River Mile 20 of the North Fork Tutel, it's basically the sediment dam is what it's called. It's called officially a sediment retention structure. So it's this large dam where, behind it is all of the sediments from the eruption, or what's left of them, billions of metric tons of fine sediment that just kind of trickles, it's loosed a little bit every year. I mean, they still have to do a lot of dredging, from just that little bit of sediment that comes out every year. So on the, talking about lines at Mount St. Helens, the sediment retention structure, the sediment dam is another one where you can really see this clean, like here's a break, mountainward of it is this vast sediment plain with these sort of braided channels of river that leap, 45 or 50 feet in a year, just kind of hopping across, carving these sort of new paths for themselves. And then below the sediment dam is just the river as it more or less used to be, pretty cloudy, but a river with a straight course running down. And so the water quality, that's the control, the management of the sediment from the eruption. I mean, there's still, most of it is still up there. And so, yeah, Mount St. Helens often, the answers of Mount St. Helens tend to be pretty long-winded with no satisfying conclusion, I guess you could say, because it's still ongoing. So they haven't water quality is still a concern. I will say that. And so for there's an interesting sort of feature of that is how to bring steelhead trout and coho salmon back to their former spawning streams north or behind the sediment dam. And that's kind of an interesting story in its own right of how fish are able to navigate these pretty turbid waters.
Great. Does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to ask? I'm not seeing anything in chat. Okay. Well, I guess we'll maybe get out of here a little bit early if no one has any questions. I will remind everyone that I am going to send an email out with a link to the audience evaluation, and please fill that out. This is great. I've learned so much. Mount St. Helens is awesome. My husband's family's from Randall area.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they witnessed it. They had stories. His dad actually logged some of that after the blast. So,
another fascinating story is the salvage logging at Mount St. Helens afterwards.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
There's some cool stories. So
yeah.
Great. Thank you guys all so much and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.